Okay, so today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos Daf Pei. Hey, we're Yevamos 85. We're going to start on Pei Dal on Beis around 15 lines on the bottom. Where it says Gufa. So about a previous statement that Amar Yehuda Marav Huzaru Ksheros Minasa Upsu, and that women who are Kohanim, they don't have a concern. There's no prohibition against them marrying a Kohen who's disqualified, who disqualify them from the kahuna and therefore make their children halalim. So the Gemara says, Lema Messiah, let's bring a support for Rabbi Yehuda Marav's statement, because we say halal shenasa kashera, because the statement was that if there's a halal, it said in our Mishnah, if there's a kohen who's a halal who married a kashera, and then if he had a kosher brother, she's included in the one who she's permitted to her husband and prohibited to her Yevamos. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. What is that case referring to? My love, isn't it referring to Kohenos Ru'uyalo? Isn't it referring to a woman, a Kohenes who's Ru'uyalo, and that meaning to say that she's able to marry this halal? My kasher. What does it mean when it says kasher? Doesn't it mean kasher or kahuna? Doesn't it mean that she's kosher to marry a kohen? Isn't that what it's referring to? Gemara says no, that's not what I'm referring to. Lo Yisraelis. It's referring to a regular Jewish woman. Umay kashera. And what does it mean when it says kasher? Kasher al kahal, that she's kosher to marry into the community. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, leishalach kasher. If that's the case, if you want to say, well, then the scenario that it's referring to is where he has a kosher brother, nami kosher l'kahal, that's also referring to somebody who's kosher to the community. Meklal dehu pasol kal. You mean to say that that brother himself is disqualified to the community, and we don't want to say that because the halal kosher, because the halal is allowed to marry into the community. So what? Elav Kohen. So we're saying he's a Kohen. Who Kohen? He Kohenis. And from the fact that he's a Kohen, we'll say that she's a Kohenis, and this proves that Kohenis is allowed to marry a Halal. And the Gemara says, no, it's not a proof. Midi Iria, Hakadis, Avakadis. It's not a proof. Each one is in its own unique way. So the Gemara says, Mosif Rabban Bar Nachman. So Rabban Bar Nachman challenges this statement of Rav that there's no prohibition against the Kohenis from marrying a Halal. So he challenges it in the following case. It says, about a woman who is a isha, about a kohen, isha zonav halal yikachu, isha grushame isha yikachu. That a kohen is not allowed to marry a zona or a divorcee. But from so the Brisa says from the fact that it said twice, well yikachu, it teaches us isha musaras laidei ish. This teaches us that the woman is warned against the man. Gemara assumes at this point that the intent of the Bryce is to say that also a woman Kohen is warned not to marry a halal. Gemara says, no, that's not the case. That's not what it necessarily means. Amarava, so Rava says, no. Any case where he's warned, she is also warned. Meaning to say it's not just a prohibition on him. That if he's warned that he's not allowed to marry a divorcee, she's also warned. But a case where he's not warned, so then, like for example, Halal, who's allowed to marry a regular woman, she's also not warned. So the Gemara says that's all the pasuk is teaching us. That's what Rava says. The Gemara says that's what the Brisa means. The Gemara says, do you think that that's the source for this idea that just like if there's a prohibition against a man marrying a divorcee, she's also not allowed to marry him for that reason, but it's not saying that a woman can't marry a halal. Is that learned out from here? But it can't be. We don't learn out from this pasuk of what Yikachu. We learn out from Rav Yehuda Marav said. Rav Yehuda Marav Isha ki asu mikol chataos adam. It says in the verse, a man or a woman who does any of the sins, the man is compared to a woman for all the punishments of the Torah. So that's all it means. Mar says, well, if that was the case, meaning to say that just like the man can't marry the divorcee can't marry the Kohen. So why do we need a special verse that we just said of lo yikachu. So the Gemara says, no, imei, if we just said that verse of isha avamina lo hushvo bekol of lo lav hashava bekol. But I would have said just by a lav hashava bekol, I would have just said that this prohibition that isha are just equivalent by a case of a lav hashava bekol, by a case of prohibition that applies to all. The lav she'eino shava bekol, well, but if it's a prohibition, it doesn't apply to everything. I wouldn't have included it. And so therefore, we need the extra verse of lo yikachu. Where it says, but what about the fact, we're on the top of 85a, what about the fact that there's a prohibition of a man, of a Kohen who's a man, of becoming Tameh, but it doesn't apply to a woman? And that's a lav she'ein shava bekol. That's a lav that's not equivalent to everyone, because it only applies to men and not to women. And the reason why we know that is because the Kasa Rahmana B'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron. Because the pasuk tells us it only applies to the sons of Aaron, which we say sons and not the daughters. So but without that pasuk, avamina nashim chayava. So it said women are obligated, even though it's a lav that's not shava bekol, because it only applies to kohanim. My time, alav mishum Rav Yehuda Marav. Mar says, isn't the reason why I would have thought it that applies to the women also because of the statement of Yehuda Marav, even though it's by a lav that's not shava bekol? The Gemara says no. The Gamrina mi lo yikachu. So no, the reason why we would have thought it doesn't apply, that the prohibition applies to women unless if it hadn't said b'nei Aaron, it's because we would have learned that from lo yikachu that all the prohibitions by a Kohen apply to the women as well. That's what we would have thought. Alternative version of how to say this is that we needed to say lo yikachu for the following reasons. You might have thought lidmor mituma. You might have thought to say, learn it out from the case of tuma, that just like women are not obligated in the prohibition against the Kohen becoming tamei, also they don't have the prohibition of marrying the Kohen if they're the ones who are divorced. So therefore, Kamash Mon, that we don't say that. Papa of Rav Huna Breder Rav Yeshua equally ansvu Israel Rav Idi Baravin. Papa Rav Yeshua came to a place called Insibu of Rav Idi Baravin. Balminayo. They asked him a fine question. Husaru Kesheros Linatzel Psuin Olo. They asked him a fine question. Can a woman who is a Kohenes, is she allowed to marry Halal? This Kohen is disqualified or not? Amar Rav Papa said Tinisua. Papa said, we learned this. Asar Yochsan Alami Bavel. There are 10 classes of lineage that came from Babylon. Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim. That's 3. Halalim, Gerim, that's 5. Harurim, the freed slaves, the Mamzerim, the Nesinim, the Shtuki, and the Asufi. These are the 10 categories of people that went up from Babylon. Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim, Mutar, and Lavod, the Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim are allowed to marry each other. Levim, Yisraelim, Levim, Yisraelim, Halalim, Gerim, Harurim, Mutar, Lavod, and we also say that the following, we say Levim, the Yisraelim, the Chalalim, and the converts and the freed slaves are also allowed to marry each other, because the Chalalim are only prohibited to the Kohen, so Chalalim can marry the Yisraelim. The converts, the freed slaves, and the Mamzerim, and the Nesinim, and the Shtuki, and the Asufi, these are all same level that they can marry each other. But it doesn't say that a Kohanos, a female Kohen, is allowed to marry a Halal. Doesn't this prove that she's not allowed to marry? No. The Mishnah only lists those cases where both sides can get married. The male and the female can marry each other, or there's a prohibition. But Kohen, keeping the of Halala, but Kohen, since if he wants to marry the Halala, it's prohibited him, well, Katani, therefore it doesn't list it. So the Azla coming to Ravidi Barabin Amaru Dardaki. So Ravidi Barabin said to him, young children, there's no prohibition of a woman who's the daughter of a Kohen of marrying a psul, of marrying somebody who's a disqualified Kohen. It's only a prohibition for the man, not for the woman. So now we had learned in our Mishnah, we had said that if there was a case of somebody who was what's called a shnios v'divrei sofrim, a rabbinic prohibition that such a woman doesn't get a ksuba. The ksuba is a marriage bond. Ksuba is a marriage bond from the man to the woman. But in the case where it was a marriage that was prohibited rabbinically, she doesn't get such a ksuba. We want them. It's a penalty. We penalize her. We don't want her to get that. We don't want her to get married. So we're not going to give her this financial incentive to get married. So okay, let's say in a circumstance she's a second degree relative to the husband, but not to her husband's brother. So then what would be the case? What's an example of that? So, like, for example, let's say they were paternal brothers, but not from the same mother. So therefore you can see a circumstance where she was related through the mother, but not through the father. So she could be a secondary degree relative to her husband, but not to the yavam. Does she get in that circumstance a ksuva from her yavam, from her husband's brother or not? Since we had a statement, since we have a statement that the ksuva goes to the estate, is mortgaged to the first husband's estate, therefore, leisla, then she doesn't get it in this case because the ksuva was mortgaged to the first husband's estate, and the first husband was second degree relative, so the rabbis penalized her. Or maybe we say, since in the circumstance where the first estate doesn't get a ksuba, we say go to the second estate. So therefore, here too, the second estate, the yavam has to pay her the ksuba. Amar Rav Sheshes Denisua. We learned ksuva sa al nechse ba'al rishon. We learned that, and we learned earlier in our tractate that the ksuva goes to the first husband's estate, but then the v'ma'isa shnil about. And we learned, but if she was a second degree relative, afil miyavam einla, that even under those circumstances, she doesn't even get it from the yavam. Miklal, but doesn't this prove, says the Gemara, the Islam miyavam, doesn't this prove that we call it the Ika the Islam yavam, that there are certain cases where the yavam does give the ksuba? And wouldn't that be our case here, where the first husband doesn't have the estate, and so we see from here that the yavam does give the ksuba. The Gemara says no. This source is missing, and this is how you read it. Ksuva the ksuba comes from the first husband's estate. If the first husband has the money, you pay from the second one. And if the second husband was a second, and if the first husband was a second degree relative, then we penalize her. We don't allow her to get the ksuva even from the yavam. So we had said that a kohenes is allowed to marry a halal, and we said that if the second degree relative gets married, we penalize her that she doesn't get a ksuba. So now they ask the question: okay, what about a circumstance of a widow to a kohen gadol? Biblical prohibition. Earlier we were talking about the rabbinic prohibitions, the second degree relatives, but now we're talking about a biblical prohibition. So what about there? Do we penalize her? A widow to a high priest, or grusha v'chalutza, a kohen hedjot, or a grusha or a chalutza to a regular kohen, yesh lem mezonos, or ein lem mezonos. Are they required? Is the husband required to support her or not? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Is the husband required to support her? So the husband is always required to support the wife as part of the obligations of the marriage. In addition to ksuba, he obligates himself to support her. But in this case, it's a biblical prohibition. They're not supposed to be married. So the marriage takes effect. So is he still required to support her or not? Gemara says, what are we talking about? If you want to say, well, that they're living together, of course he doesn't have to support her. But he's supposed to divorce her. And Mizonos Isla, and you want to say that he has to pay her money to support her? No, we want the marriage to end. So what we're talking about is the following circumstance. He married her, then he traveled away, and he's living abroad. She borrowed money, and now she's consuming it. Now, do we say, does he have to pay her for that? Like when he returns, and he could divorce her, but he can't divorce her, he's far away. Do we say Mizonai? Tonight, ksuva. Do we say the support is basically something that's listed in the ksuva? I mean, the isla ksuva from the fact that if there's a ksuva, he has a ksuva in this case, isla mizona, therefore he has to support her. Odoma, or maybe ksuva do mishkol umepik islay, because maybe ksuva, we will say she gets the ksuva because we want him to we want to get rid of her, and so therefore that's when she leaves the marriage, we'll say take the ksuva with you. But mizona dilma tiakav gabe, but the money, the ongoing support, maybe it'll incentivize her to remain in the relationship. So we say no, she does not get the mizonos here. Mara says Vatanya Yesha. We have a different source that says she does. Mara says no, that's talking about a circumstance where he's already dead. If he's already dead and she wants to sue to get the support from before the relationship, or if she died without him having divorced her, then she gets mizonos all the days of her widowhood, like all other widows, because we say that the mizone is a tanai ksuba, that after he dies, he's required to support her as part of the stipulation of the ksuba. And so now we don't have the concern that maybe they're going to remain married because he's already dead. And that's what she said. Amar le tana yeshla. So the Gemara says, Amar le tanya yeshla. There's a source that says she gets the mizonos. The Gemara says, and when does it say that? Haba amid v'hotzi. That's only, how can that be? We're supposed to get rid of him. We're supposed to get rid of the marriage. Ella yeshla. So when the price says that she gets the money, that's only after death. But while he's alive, he doesn't require to support her. So the Gemara says this irony by a biblical law, where they're in violation of the biblical law, like a divorcee to a Kohen. Then under those circumstances, she gets the ksuba, and she also gets Paris mizonos upol. She also gets the dividends of her assets. She also gets the mizonos. She gets support, and she gets the worn out clothing. And she's disqualified, and she's because she married somebody she wasn't allowed to. She and her offspring are disqualified. The kofano solohotzi, and we force him to divorce her. But shnios, but let's say it's a second degree rabbinic relative. Shnios, we divrei sofrim. Let's say it's a second degree relative. Ein lo ksuva, she doesn't get the ksuva. Lo peiro, she doesn't get the fruits. Lo mazonos, she doesn't get the money, the support. Lo belos, the ikshera, and since it's a secondary degree, she's kosher. Uvada kosher, and her offspring is kosher. V'kofano solotzi, and we force him to get divorced. I'm Rabbi Shimon Elazar. So Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, I don't understand this price. Why does the widow to the high priest get a ksuva? What's the reasoning why the widow to the Kohen Gadol, which is a biblical prohibition, she gets a ksuva, but rabbinic prohibition, she doesn't get the ksuva? What's the logic there? So Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, what's the reason why the widow to the Kohen Gadol gets a ksuva? Because they're both because as a result of this relationship, they both become kalalim, they both become disqualified. In any case where they're both disqualified, on top of 85b, kansu oso ksuva. They penalize her, and they say she doesn't get the ksuva. Meaning to say, the sages penalized him, just the opposite of what I said. Sages penalized him and said that he is going to have to pay the ksuva, meaning to say the sages left him in the same position of obligating him to pay the ksuva because, and the reason is, we'll read Rashi, they didn't say he has to do more than he has to do in other circumstance, meaning to say they didn't penalize him worse. They just didn't change the situation. But the reason why, if it's a second degree relative, second degree prohibition, there they say she doesn't get the ksuba, is because we don't want her to remain married to him. Because since if she wouldn't have the ksuba from him, she would just leave the relationship. But here, we don't need it because Rashi says she's going to leave anyway because since he's also disqualified, as a result of this, they're going to be fighting. And so therefore, that's what Rashi explains it. The Gemara is going to discuss it more. From it says the Gemara, what's the reason why in a second degree relative, second degree prohibition, rabbinic prohibition, she doesn't get ksuva? Because they're both not, they don't become disqualified as a result of this, because the rabbinic prohibition, they don't become halalim. And as a result of that, any case where they're both disqualified from where any place where they're both kosher to each other. Then they said that they take away her ksuva because she doesn't actually become a halal as a result of it, so they take away her ksuva. And Rebbe explains it differently. Rebbe says, no, what's the reason why she loses her ksuva only when it's a rabbinic prohibition, but not when it's a biblical prohibition? Rebbe says, hello, divrei Torah. No, because by the biblical prohibition, ironically, because it's worse, divrei Torah ain't shrichim chizuk. We don't need to strengthen it. Because it's worse, we don't need to strengthen it. And they'll know on their own not to do it. Hello, divrei sofrim shrichim chizuk. But by rabbinic law, because we want to strengthen the rabbi's position, then we need chizik for it, and so therefore we're going to say she doesn't get her ksuba. The Gemara gives an alternative answer. Davar acher. Alternatively, zeu he margila zeu hu margila v'zu he margila. So, in the case of the going to the divorcee, he's the one who brought it about. He's the one who convinced it to happen. The going over to the widow, because he's the one who convinced her to do it. And in the rabbinic prohibition, because she doesn't get disqualified as a result, she's the one who convinced him, and that's why she loses her ksuva. So the Gemara says, "Davar achar man katani." Well, who's the source of this davar achar? Says that when he's the one who convinces her to do it, he has to pay the ksuva. Otherwise, she does. Ikada Amri, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar katani. Some say that it was Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said that, remember we saw at the bottom, because he says any time where she's disqualified and she's disqualified, they say he has to pay the ksuva. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Matam Kamar, he says, Matam Amr hu pasol v'hi psula kansuo so ksuva. What's the reason where he's disqualified and she's disqualified? They say he has to pay the ksuva. Because he's the one who convinces her to get married. Because even though she's going to get disqualified, she gets married. Matam hu kasher. What's the reason when he's kosher and she's kshera kansu otak ksuva? They say she has to pay the ksuva. Because she's the one there. Because she's the one who doesn't become disqualified. She convinces him to get married, and that's why we take away the ksuva. Igud Amar, but others say, who's the one who said this davar acher? That's Rebbe Katanila. That Rebbe is the one who says it, and he says v'chalutza kakashile. And because Rebbe's initial logic was that by biblical prohibition, we say she loses the ksuva. She doesn't lose the ksuva only by a rabbinic one. Does she need the ksuva because divrei Torah ain't shrichim chizuk? And so that we say that Rebbe is the one who says the davar acher. That when he convinces her, he loses it. When she convinces him, he loses it. And how do we say it? Chalutza kakashile, because chalutza was difficult to him. What was chalutza kakashile? Look at the Rashi. Rashi says, hold on. Rashi says, "Shanatzim tamud dvarim nation angel Torah." That Rebbe gave an explanation. The kashile, the chalutza, because he says Rebbe says that when it's a biblical law. And when it's a biblical law, we don't need to strengthen it, and so therefore, he still has to pay the ksuba. But it was difficult. Chalutza to a Kohen is not a biblical law; it's a rabbinic law, and so and nevertheless, we say that she has a ksuba there, even though it's rabbinic law. So that was what's difficult. The chalutza the bottom the islay ksuva, and still, even though it's rabbinic law. Hadar Amar, then he says, well, keeping the pasal midrabanan, we'll always say, the reason is because since it's only rabbinic prohibition, zel margila, vizuhi margila. So she's the one, when it's rabbinic prohibition, she's the one who convinces him, and therefore she loses the ksuva. Ma'ika ben Rebbe or Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. What's the distinction between Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Well, the distinction between them is Amar Chisda, Mamzeres and Nesina Yisrael, Ika ben The difference between them is by Mamzeres, Nesina, to a regular Jew is a difference between them. So Mandam or Dioraisa, the one who says that it's Dioraisa, i.e. the position of Rabbi says, but Divrei Torah doesn't need chizik, Anami Dioraisa. Well, these are Dioraisa, and therefore she shouldn't lose the ksuva. Mandam Nesha Umar Giwa, but the one who says the Rabbi says no, when he convinces it, he loses the ksuva, but if she's not going to become disqualified, she'll be the one to convince him, and she'll lose the ksuba. She's the one who convinced him, and so therefore she'll lose the ksuba. Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that there is the case who he argues in Rabbi Tarf, and he says that Evan and Mamzer, the offspring will be kosher. Although Margo Evo Midi, he's not going to be interested to marry her because his offspring will not be kosher, even if he'll marry a shivcha. So Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef says, a man who remarries his divorced wife after she married in between, that's a distinction. According to the one who says, according to one who says, Rabbi, that by a diraisa he doesn't lose his ksuva hanami diraisa. Well, this is a biblical law. But according to the one who says that when he seduces her, he convinces her he loses the ksuva, but but she's going to be the one to convince him because her offspring are not going to be mamzerim here, so she's going to want to pursue this marriage, and so she'll lose the ksuva. Or Rabbi Akiva Damar Yesh Mamzer Mechayv Elav. And according to Rabbi Akiva, who says no, their offspring in that case will be a mamzer, and she wouldn't want to do it. So under those circumstances, she's not going to try and convince him to get married because her offspring will be a mamzer. The prohibition of there's a positive commandment for going to marry a virgin. So if she's married already, if she was not a virgin, that's a distinction. She won't lose the ksuba because it's the biblical law. She's going to convince him to do this marriage because her offspring are not going to be considered chalolim because it's only a positive commandment. Or Rabbi, well, what about according to Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov who says yesh chalom mechayve as according to Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov says that there are chalolim even from positive commandments. She's not going to want her offspring to be a halal. It's where he brings back his wife after she's a ambiguous sota, which is a prohibition. Well, that's a diaraisa. But the offspring is not going to be a mamzer here. So she's going to convince him to try and get married. Or Rabbi Masi ben Charsh Amar Afilu Halach Bala. But according to Rabbi Masi ben Charsh, no, she would be disqualified in this circumstance. She would be a zona. She wouldn't be the one to do it. Amar Ravashi, Sota Vada where he knows for sure that she is a sota. So then, both according to Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, according to Rabbi, this is a biblical law, and so therefore she won't lose her ksuva. And according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says, well, zuhi margil also this sota has not become a zona because she's already a zona, so it's not going to make a difference. And so therefore, and her offspring are not mamzerim, and so therefore she's the one who convinced her to get married, and so therefore she'll lose her ksuva. Okay, I just want to remind people before we stop. I want to remind people that today we're going to do the next daf at noon,